Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last session or the last unit of our session together with some shorter works. Our reading is shorter than perhaps previous readings have been. And of course, we close out our Vaith readings from reading between the lines. So I'm not going to concentrate too much on the Vaith material in this lecture, but I do want to point out a couple of matters which I think are particularly important. Modernism and postmodernism are not necessarily antithetical to Christianity. In fact, Christians often find themselves in these modes of thought, modernism with its attempts at recovering something authentic, and postmodernism with its attempts at seeing how how clarity may not be as easily achieved as people might think. Those concepts are not alien to Christians. In fact, we might even say that the Gospels themselves are a kind of critique of certainty found in Pharisaical thought. You have heard it said this, but I tell you it's actually more complicated than you thought it was, right? Paraphrasing Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm also not arguing that modernism and postmodernism are convertible with Christianity. Certainly there are concepts in those modes of thought, those time periods, however we want to call them, that compete with Christianity, that attempt to undermine Christianity. The idea of making truth relative, for instance, is something that we would not affirm as Christians. We would say that truth is not relative, and nevertheless, Christians would also affirm that truth can be complex, right? It can be complicated. There are some certainties from a Christian perspective, the existence of God, that Christ came as his Son, and there are also uncertainties that we as Christians acknowledge. Just how complicated is the fall in nature, for instance? How much of nature is affected by the fall? How much of it is, bacteria, viruses? That might be more complex. Those seem to be part of God's creation too. So, in matters concerning God's disposition to humanity, we as Christians affirm that the gospel account of Christ's life, the gospel account of what Christ has done for us, is the most important knowable truth that we can know, that we can have, and the Gospels give it to us, unambiguously give it to us. Yes, there are points in Jesus' life and teaching that can be puzzling, but what is not puzzling is that God loved the world so much that he sent his only Son to die, and that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Right? There's no ambiguity in that statement, even though some of our doctrinal attempts at creating maybe codified doctrines around it could be a bit muddled. We know that God is interested in saving us. Another point and I think Vaith actually does an excellent job presenting that balanced view that the critiques modernism had of the idealistic projects of the Enlightenment, that those critiques are valid critiques, and that the postmodern critique of modernism's attempt to clean things up, those are valid critiques also. And so anyway, I think Vaith does a good job from a Christian perspective presenting a balanced view of those matters. I also want to draw your attention to, just briefly, to the section on the makers of literature. And I think, for me, one of the things I have emphasized in this course over the years is the concept of the parallel Christian culture, and Vaith talks about that in his chapter on. I've already forgotten what it's called, the makers of literature. Vaith points out that a lot of times in modern Christianity we have created a sort of parallel, for lack of a better word, a parallel market to what is mainstream, thinking that we have created something sanctified, when in fact we may be participating in exactly what the world is interested in, but under a veneer of Christianity. So I think Veith does a good job of alerting us to that possibility. We didn't read it for this course, but there's another book by Frank Birch Brown called Good Taste, Bad Taste, and Christian Taste. And Frank Birch Brown also talks about these difficulties, right? The difficulties of parallel Christian culture or parallel Christian market, or whatever we want to call it, category that runs next to secular or world categories, and can be problematic. Well, Frank Birch Brown also says that even in the problems of that, nevertheless, God can be found in those kitschy Christianized versions of popular culture. Right? Somebody could go to a Jesus-themed mini golf park, which is, about one of the most profane things somebody could imagine, and nevertheless, God, in His grace and sovereignty, in using something that might be of bad taste, could move an individual to draw nearer to Him in a mysterious way. It's not an argument for creating Christian-themed mini golf parks, but it's an argument of God's ability to transcend barriers, or even that no barrier forestalls God's power. That God is bigger than culture, and God is bigger than some well-intentioned but misguided attempts at doing Christian versions of culture. Right? God's arm is not shortened in either case. And yes, people can find God, experience God, embrace God as He works His grace in worldly contexts, just as people can find and experience God in the, I'm going to call it the kitschy market Christianity. I think it's well-meaning, but kitschy market Christianity. People can find God in that too. So maybe that's a signal that we can humble ourselves before the work of God, rather than getting preoccupied in, what's good taste, bad taste, good taste or bad taste. And I know, again, we didn't read that book for this class, but if you are interested in it, you can send me an email. I'm happy to give you the name of the book or repeat it to you. Right, again, it's by Frank Birch Brown, B-U-R-C-H, Frank Birch Brown. And it's called Good Taste, Bad Taste, and Christian Taste. I'm looking for it on my shelf. Well, it might be at home. In any case, let's turn our attentions to the literary readings now. We have 4 poets and 5 poems. One of them is an epitaph, very short, 2 lines long. W.H. Auden, we're looking at 2 works from him, The Shield of Achilles and Epitaph to the Unknown Soldier, or Epitaph for the Unknown Soldier. And in these poems, we find the starts or the seeds of postmodern critique of the things that were supposed to free us, the things that were supposed to maybe be good for us. Auden in Shield of Achilles is writing about World War II. His poem appears, a decade after the World War II was over. And the Shield of Achilles, if you remember, was described for us by Homer in Book 18 of Iliad, right? It was the last couple hundred lines or so of Book 18, where Hephaestus creates this very vital, vibrant scene on Achilles' shield. And it becomes a kind of symbol of the conflict of the Trojan War in particular, and maybe a symbol of human conflict generally. The scenes on the shield express that. Auden takes the idea of the shield expressing something about the immediate war and shows Achilles' shield in this light, in the context of World War II, as not presenting vibrant, vital scenes of life and its condition, but presenting scenes of World War II and the pessimism about the human condition. Pessimism, by the way, with which Christians would agree, right? We as Christians do not believe that human beings at their core are morally right. We believe that something has gone wrong and we need to be redeemed from it. Now, I know that there are nuanced views of that among denominations associated with things like baptism and so on and so forth. I understand that. But we as Christians affirm, broadly speaking, that there is an original sin, something has gone wrong, and the universe is broken. And the Shield of Achilles is showing that World War II reveals things like political activism, political action, right? These large movements, political movements, can be dangerous and not freeing, showing that industry, which was a provider of employment for so many people in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, that industry itself created a situation in which we could kill massive numbers of people and do it impersonally. And Auden's Shield of Achilles is presenting us with that idea. We see a couple of stanza forms in here. The first one is almost a kind of, it's an octave form, right? It's 8 lines long. It is very sing-songy, I think, in its approach. And then whenever it switches to the descriptions of the shield itself, we move to what's almost rhyme royale. It's an odd number set of verses, or an odd number set of lines, and the rhythmic pattern is very regular, iambic pentameter, which is associated with heroic poetry. And it almost has the effect of creating this very square, and I know shields around, but creating this square effect in the presentation of Achilles' shield, what's really on Achilles' shield through the lens of World War II, and what's really on the Achilles' shield is bareness. There's no flourishing life. It's the product of mechanized warfare. It's also the product of looking at axioms, and I think he has on here statistics, right? The self-assurity of scientific descriptions of human behavior or human characteristics, and figuring those things out scientifically. I know I'm using a lot of air quotes. Doesn't lead us to enlightenment. It potentially leads us to destroying each other. Now, I have good friends in the psychology department here at Regent University, Doctors Jones and Hankel and some others, and I'm not disparaging their work. I think it's important, and I don't think Auden is necessarily disparaging their work also. I think perhaps the more robust critique is of the assurity, the audacity that we have to be sure about things because we've observed them and measured them, and we have industry and we have technology to help us. I've said this to many of my classes. I don't remember if I've said it to you all. There's not a lot of difference between us and the people of the past, just as there are, if you've traveled the world, there's not a lot of difference between human beings from culture to culture. Yes, the cultural details change, the times we eat meals change, the context, like do we use our hands, context of fellowship, those change. But what doesn't change is the human need to be in contact with each other, the human desire for things like ease and comfort. I'm not talking about laziness. The desire to pursue things that are meaningful. Going from one culture to another doesn't make that incomprehensible. It's something that we connect to. And that ever persistent, I suppose, human condition is something that technology has a tendency to obscure, right? Technology looks like, because technologies change and we perceive it as advancement, we also often, not always, but often perceive ourselves to be advancing, when in fact we are in the same fallen condition we've always been in, a condition that ancient poets like Homer and modern poets like Auden recognized, right, and have been recognized throughout the ages. And we see Thetis. Remember, the mother of Achilles is watching. This is Auden's presentation. Is watching Hephaestus build the shield, just like she did in Book 18. Watching Hephaestus build this or forge this shield, and then to vindicate the power of her son, to vindicate the value of her son. And what do we see at the end in the final stanza? After the final point on the final scene on the shield of the ragged urchin who's throwing things at birds, who believes the only truths that matter are things like two boys will stab a third boy, that how does it say, that girls are just raped, that's what happens, those are axiomatic to him. Those are the shield of Achilles' scenes. We see after that the thin-lipped armorer Hephaestus hobbled away. Thetis of the shining breasts cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son, the strong, iron-hearted man slaying Achilles, who would not live long. And Auden here is giving a very forceful critique of those who believe, of those in powerful positions who believe that the forging of a special device like a shield is somehow going to work in their best interest. There's more to it going on than that. That's my particular focus on it. We also have the epitaph for the unknown soldier. I won't analyze it too much. I'll just read it here. It's two lines only. Epitaph for the unknown soldier. To save your world you asked this man to die. Would this man, could he see you now, ask why? I don't think Auden is trying to be cute and like, zing, gotcha. I don't think he's going for that effect. I think what he's trying to do is provoke us to consider whether or not those who have given their lives for causes, in this case it looks like the cause of World War II, if those who had given their lives would look at the results of the cause and say, you know what, my life was worth sacrificing. Some would, for sure. Others might not. Auden is just raising the question and bringing us away from the realm of audacious, blind assurity, blanket statements, right? In your composition classes, you've probably heard of the sweeping generalization. He's trying to draw us away from that. We turn now to John Betjeman, who is writing a poem similarly placed, right, World War II, and also presenting to us a speaker that may not embody the idealistic qualities of fighting in World War II or being on the Allied side in World War II. For better or for worse, we are often presented World War II in terms of us versus them, right? For better in the sense that there really are evil forces at work in the world that do need to be confronted. For worse in the sense that we often forget that we ourselves are susceptible to similar evil. In fact, Tolkien, right, I'm always happy to talk about Tolkien. Tolkien, in a letter to, I think it was to one of his sons or maybe to a publisher or something, he said he had seen orcs. Now, metaphorically speaking, of course, not literal orcs, but he had seen orcs where? In the military, in the British Air Force, or the British Army, rather. He had seen orcs, evil, twisted, despicable people who were leaders in the British Army. And this was during World War I when he fought. And so for Tolkien, the possibility of being an orc, of being which is symbolic for someone who has been twisted into evil, and that twisting is usually self-twisting, who is soul sick, perhaps is another way to describe it, that person is on our side also, right? Maybe the armies of orcs we can see arrayed on the battlefield against us. We tend to forget or neglect that similar types of individuals are in the trenches with us. John Betjeman's in Westminster Abbey is not about the orcs in the trenches, but might be about, and maybe not about orcs, but might be about a certain kind of individual who uses piety and empty symbolism in order to shield oneself from reality, to shield oneself from the real difficulty of conflict. And so we have a woman speaker, right? We know she's a woman because in line 6 she says to the Lord, like, listen to a lady's cry, meaning my cry. And we have the beginning of her prayer is this alarming, really arresting line. Gracious Lord, O balm the Germans, spare their women for thy sake. And if that is not too easy, we will pardon thy mistake, right? So this is a woman whose preoccupations with the temporal, with thinking that she is in this transcendent relationship, she is in a relationship of deliverance with God, she's actually deluded. She's really in the worries of the world. The cares that are a burden to her, she is not cast upon the Lord, but she is carrying them around, believing somehow that these are the things that matter. Right? Oh, we'll pardon you, Lord, if you don't do this. And whatever the case may be, don't let anybody bomb me. Now, Betjeman isn't trying to imply that during war everybody should go out and get bombed so they can experience that. Betjeman is just pointing out the ignorance associated with the difficulties of war. This speaker here, this woman, sees war as something that maybe is an inconvenience to her, perhaps more than an inconvenience, doesn't understand that good and evil, which are real things, right? There's no questioning the existence of good and evil here. The question is whether good and evil can be totally located outside of us and our side. Guide thy forces. We see even a hint of racism here, right? She's guide our forces, right? The colored people, the blacks from far Jamaica, Honduras, and Togoland, protect them, but even more protect the whites. So this woman again is in this kind of ignorant, we would call it racist, although racist has taken on such a technical, kind of like a technical meaning, it almost doesn't embody the personal depravity that this woman is feeling, right? She's just, save my side, save people like me. I think that's a more alarming way of putting it. She says, think of what our nation stands for. This is line 20. Books from Boots. So Boots was a pharmacy, and they had like a little lending library, from what I understand. You can go in there, you could get great works of literature at the drugstore. And she's saying that's what the nation stands for, a lending library in a drugstore, which is absurd. That country lanes, that's what matters. Free speech, free passes, class distinction, that's what our nation stands for. It's good to have the classes separated from each other. Democracy and proper drainage, right? The proper drains. This is all of the modern things. The modern world of England can be summed up in these kinds of points, Lord, right? That's what really matters. What doesn't matter, or at least implicitly doesn't matter, are the individuals who are suffering and dying, the individuals who will touch war in a way that she never will and doesn't want to. She even tries to downplay her own sin, right? She's like, okay, I know I'm a sinner, but I haven't done terrible things. Maybe I have earned maybe I've earned a special place with you. And she talks about, I'll even send white feathers to the cowards, right? I'll even insult and shame those who are not on our side. And she doesn't realize the whole time that the disposition of the coward is part of her own disposition, right? It's a facet of her own character that she is blind to. And so the prayer in Westminster Abbey becomes a prayer of a prayer of hypocrisy, a prayer of ignorance, and maybe even a prayer of depravity and sin. Is she an orc? I don't think she's an orc. I don't suspect she is, but she is definitely not in the place she thinks she is, and the things that she thinks are valuable, the things she believes signify worth, are not the things that signify worth. All right, moving now from Betjeman's in Westminster Abbey, let's turn our attention to Georgia Douglas Johnson and her poem Moods. Now, this is the first time I've taught Moods for English 205. I've taught it in another class before, but I think it still fits with some of these modern ideas about looking at the world and seeing difficulty, potential hopelessness, and how we address that. So in the previous two poems, the focus is on, or the previous two poets, the focus is on World War II and the broken promises of an industrial world and the delusionality of modernity as some sort of divine condition. Here we see also difficulty, but we see difficulty presented in a more hopeful lens, like Virgil did in the Eclogues. Georgia Douglas Johnson was part of the Harlem Renaissance movement, so she's African American poet, and who was writing at a time where great artists, not just poets but musicians, playwrights, and others were emerging from Harlem in New York and making contributions, arguably great contributions to the Western artistic tradition. So we have a 12-line poem here. It's not a sonnet. Sonnets are 14 lines. We see that the speaker, who's probably Johnson herself, says that her heart is pregnant with great despair. Let me read it. I think it's short enough to read. My heart is pregnant with great despair, with much beholding of my people's care, mid blinded prejudice and nurtured wrong, exhaling wantonly the days along. I mark faith's fragile craft of cheering light, tossing imperiled on the sea of night, and then, in anguish, comes my heart's low cry, God, God, I crave to learn the reason why. Again, in spirit loftily I soar, with winged vision through earth's outer door. In such an hour it is mine to see, in frowning fortune, smiling destiny. So as with Virgil, Johnson doesn't gloss over the realities, the difficulties of the world, right? She presents difficulty. She presents even the problem of faith sometimes looking like a fragile boat, almost like this rickety lifeboat that we are in. Now, she's not saying that faith inevitably leads us wrong. She's just saying that living in faith sometimes is very hard. It's very hard to do. And she cries out and she wonders. And it's interesting, too, that she doesn't provide us the answer that she gets. What she does provide us, however, is a glimmer of hope that perhaps there is an answer. And in I think a good poetic move, she allows the reader to not only consider what the speaker may have seen, but also allows the reader to consider what such a vision might look for him or her. So Johnson's moods, the poem moods, it's probably also rooted in racism that she has witnessed and experienced. Right, the first two lines talking about beholding her people's care, beholding her people's difficulties, anxieties. So it's probably rooted in that, and nevertheless, it has this great universal application, potential for great universal application. Moving now to Gwendolyn Brooks's To the Young Who Want to Die. So this is, I've taught this before in English 205 last year. I usually, in a spring semester, I'll usually have T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday, and in the fall semester we'll have, Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. So I toyed with the idea of including something different. I didn't want to, create more reading. It's already intense enough. But I stumbled upon Gwendolyn Brooks's poem here, and to my understanding, so the note that I put in here says that it was published in the Near Johannesburg Boy and Other Poems in 1987. But in doing some research, I think this poem may have originated as a spoken word poem, like originally delivered orally, and maybe even preceding 1987, right before 1987 sometime. I also think if you were to look on YouTube or Google, do a Google search, I think you can find Gwendolyn Brooks reciting this poem. So this is the only poem of ours that kind of extends beyond the mid-20th century material like Auden and Johnson and Betjeman, and comes up to our own time. And I think To the Young Who Want to Die is a poem that still connects with this Western literary tradition, which I will talk about in just a minute. Still connects with this Western literary tradition. Let me read it. I think this one's also worth reading. It's short, but it's poignant and dense, right? I think and intense. Listen to this poem, To the Young Who Want to Die. Sit down, inhale, exhale. The gun will wait. The lake will wait. The tall gall in the small seductive vial will wait, will wait. We'll wait a week. We'll wait through April. You do not have to die this certain day. Death will abide, will pamper your postponement. I assure you, death will wait. Death has a lot of time. Death can attend to you tomorrow or next week. Death is just down the street, is most obliging neighbor, can meet you any moment. You need not die today. Stay here, through pout or pain or peskiness. Stay here. See what the news is going to be tomorrow. Graves grow no green that you can ever use. Remember, green's your color. You are spring. And I think this fits with a lot of the anxieties that people throughout the ages experience, but especially now in with postmodernism's skepticism about the ability of human beings to do anything good, about the ideal ever being found, or whether or not it exists. That can lead to great despair, and that great despair has been a hallmark of our, I think, probably the past half century or so. Again, it's not unique to humanity. Other people have experienced it in their lives. Ancient poets have written about it. Nevertheless, it seems to be predominant in this moment. And Brooks's poem, I find, I don't have a lot scholarly to say about it. I'll be honest with you. I just find it very encouraging and not just encouraging, like, oh, how nice, but also perceptive. Perceptive in seeing death as something that is always a threat and it doesn't need to be invited. Uh, to the young who want to die, you don't need to invite death. It's coming for you. Don't speed it along. Because in the meantime, you might be able to see tomorrow. You might be able to see possibilities. If you invite death, if you have the gun or the lake or the poison, whatever the case may be, how does she say it, right? All of that stuff will wait. Um, it can meet you anytime. Hang on just a second. See what the news is going to be tomorrow, right? Death will oblige. You don't need to hurry it along. Remember in The Baron of Grogzwig, the Baron has this moment where he laughs at the genius of suicide and despair, and that breaks the spell of his desire to take his life, right? It makes the genius very uneasy. Like, why are you laughing? Stop laughing. Well, that hopefulness is still an aspect of the human condition, right? Of living in the world. Yes, it is a fallen world. Yes, there are terrible things that have happened, and sin afflicts it. Yes, all of those things are true. Nevertheless, hope has as its objects things which are fulfilled. In the ultimate sense, it's our reconciliation to the Lord, right? Our reconciliation through Christ's work. But there are also moments of that fulfillment that we experience in life, and Brooks's presentation of death as an obliging neighbor, right? Death isn't even really an opponent here. Death is just, kind of like, hey, he's the garbage collector or the mailman or whatever, right? He's always there. He's just down the street, right? You're not going to get away from him anyway. So don't speed it along. And I love the final couplet, lines 16 and 17. Graves grow no green that you can ever use, right? Yes, of course, graves have green grass on them, but that's of no use to those buried in those spots. Green is the color of life, and it's your color, Brooks is arguing, right? It's yours, and you are spring. You are in a hopeful place, and this is to the young, right? To the young who want to die. You have a whole life ahead of you. Of course, from instant to instant, we could say, well, death might tragically attend the young. Yes, that's true. But it doesn't have to be sped along. Spring is still the inheritance not the inheritance, it's still the situation of the young. Even if they tragically die in spring, hopefulness, the future ahead, that's their possession. All right, now let me switch gears and talk about Western literature generally. So we didn't spend a ton of time in our lectures discussing what characterizes Western literature and what even that term means. But I want to take a few moments to consider the matter. Western literature is a label it's a label of convenience. It's a good label, it's not bad. It's a label of convenience that identifies, in literary terms, Western literature, works which seem to have endured, and not only endured, but prevailed in the cultures associated with the West. So this would be European culture for the most part, European culture, North Africa, maybe the ancient Near East as well. There's nothing magical about Western literature, so it's not a transcendent category. It's not as if the works in Western literature have a special, like a magical, spiritual quality about them. It just seems that these works have connected with people throughout the ages and expressed the human condition. I know that is it's almost meaningless. It's used so much, but there's a reason it's used so much, right? It's a good term. It expresses these ideas of the human condition that people in the West find congenial. Now, it doesn't mean those ideas are limited to the West, because we could find in the East people who want to live in comfort, people who want honor, people who want freedom from despair. Right? That's not unique to the West. Spirituality is not unique to the West. We can find that in the East. We can find that in other places. Right? That's not unique. What really designates the West is that word West. It looks like it's a geographic region. And even that geographic region, my colleagues like Dr. Skiles and Dr. Grimm will remind me, the West, that term, even that fluctuates from time to time. Is Turkey part of the West? And what age are we talking about when we describe the West? Is America part of the West? It seems to go excessively to the West and makes England and Europe the East in some ways. I'm not trying to be cute by saying it that way. But it is a term that's associated with a certain pedigree. We could think of it as a family tree. We could think of it as the Elam family. The Elam family is unique because of its association with the Elams. But we are not unique in terms of having ancestors, living on property or owning property, working in various occupations. That's not limited to the Elam family. What designates the Elam family is Michael Elam, me, or Benjamin, my son, or Edgar, my father, or Benton, my grandfather. Right? Those are the things that make that label meaningful. So Western literature is, again, kind of a pedigree, regional term, a family resemblance. If I were to be pressed about certain things that may be characteristic of the West and Western literature, I might say something like the Trojan War. That's a Western war. I might say something like the Industrial Revolution, which happens in the West. It doesn't mean that wars were unique to the West. It doesn't mean that progress in technology was unique to the West. It just means that particular war was especially important, and people wrote about it, and it resonated. That this moment in history, development of the printing press, was especially important in that region, and people have benefited from it. So, if you encountered a question on a test about, like what characterizes Western literature, just keep that in mind. I will not ask you to define what Western literature is, but it might be good to know what you would consider in order to start defining that term. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for a great session together. I know, it's only 8 weeks that we have to spend together, but I've appreciated it. I know we're not face-to-face talking in these videos. I've met a few of you outside the context of these lectures. I was pleased to meet all of you. I'm glad you took the class. And remember, this is kind of a weird, maybe sermon turn we're taking here. Remember that the Lord does love you, that His arm is powerful to help you, maybe to save you, maybe to remind you of the promises He's made towards you. Take encouragement in that, and for sure, He is interested in reconciling you to Himself and has made that way. We've been studying literature in this course, which maybe give us a little glimpse of that or hints of that reality. And I hope you've enjoyed it so far. And I hope maybe you'll read some of these works of literature outside of the class or expand on them. In any case, thank you very much. The Lord bless you. I'll see you.